London calls itself a city of order. The Old Bailey, the Metropolitan Police, the statute books. For the women in this list, it meant something different. A grandmother who shipped a ton of cocaine before dawn. A woman who kept a decapitated body for a fortnight. A fugitive who laundered $1 billion. These are London's most notorious women. Section 1. Alice Diamond and the 40 Elephants. Elephant and Castle in the final years of the 19th century was not the place the name suggested. There was nothing regal about it. The area around the old tavern that gave the district its name was a dense pocket of South London poverty, a landscape of slum housing, overcrowded courts, shared standpipes, and families stacked 4 and 5 to a room. Charles Booth, the social researcher who spent years walking London streets recording what he found, had mapped the streets around the Elephant in dark blue and black, the colours on his poverty map that indicated the lowest conditions. It was a place where men worked the docks and the leather trade and the railway yards, and where women worked constantly at everything that kept a household from collapse. Crime was not imported into this neighbourhood. It grew there, the way it always grows, out of need and proximity, and the habits passed down through families who had nothing else to offer. Out of those streets, in the 1870s, came one of the most unusual criminal organisations in British history. A gang of women, later known to the press as the 40 Thieves and to the police as the 40 Elephants, had begun operating in the West End of London. They were shoplifters by trade, professionals by practice, and at their height, they were described by a police detective as the cleverest shoplifters in the country. Their targets were the great department stores of Oxford Street, Regent Street, and Bond Street. Establishments built on the idea that respectable women could browse freely without harassment, that a woman of apparent means could move through a shop floor unattended. The 40 Elephants understood that better than the stores did. They dressed accordingly, spent years refining the techniques, and moved through those marble-floored halls with the confidence of women who belonged there. For decades, the police could do very little about it. The first documented leader on record was a woman named Mary Carr, a fence as much as a thief, well known to the Metropolitan Police by the end of the Victorian era. Carr was good at selling what the gang took, at moving merchandise quickly through a network of contacts in the market stalls and pawnbrokers and clothing traders who occupied the boundary between the legitimate and the criminal economies of South London. She ran a loosely organised operation. The gang under her leadership was more collective than structured, a network of women with shared knowledge and shared connections, rather than a defined hierarchy. Carr was repeatedly arrested and repeatedly released, the short sentences for shoplifting in that era being a cost of business, rather than a deterrent. She eventually moved to Manchester, where she died in 1924, having spent most of her adult life in and out of the courts. What followed her departure was something different in scale and ambition. Around 1915, leadership of the gang passed to a woman named Alice Diamond, and the 40 Elephants became a different kind of organisation entirely. Diamond had been born in 1896 in the Lambeth Workhouse Infirmary, which was as stark a beginning as London offered. Her father, Thomas, was a criminal with multiple convictions, including one for assaulting the son of the Lord Mayor of London by putting his head through a glass door at a political meeting. Alice was the eldest of 7 children, raised in Walworth in conditions that gave her no particular reason to expect much from the legal economy. She was first cautioned at 16 for stealing chocolate. By the time she was 19, she was already being tracked by the Metropolitan Police Criminal Record Office as a habitual criminal. By her early 20s, she was running the gang. The name Diamond came from the jewellery she wore. She dressed in furs and diamonds, rings stacked on her fingers, and she was not wearing them purely for decoration. The rings were functional. She was physically imposing, close to 6 feet tall and powerful, and she was known to use those rings as a set of improvised knuckle dusters on anyone who interfered with her operations or crossed her authority. Police officers warned each other that she had a punch to beware of. The press, when they caught up with her, called her the giant queen of the terrors, the Amazon of the underworld. She once required 6 police officers to hold her down during an arrest. She was not performing strength, she simply had it, and she used it as a management tool, both within the gang and in dealings with the wider criminal world. What Alice Diamond built under her leadership was not a loose collective. It was a structured enterprise with rules, cells, territories and a code of conduct that members were expected to follow or face consequences. The gang divided itself into operational cells, each allocated to a specific part of London or a specific type of target. Each cell moved through its assigned patch until police attention made that patch too hot, then rotated elsewhere. The West End stores were the primary target, the department stores of the interwar period being among the most profitable environments for skilled hoisting the country had ever produced. Shop stock had shifted by the early 20th century away from locked cases and toward open display, furs on hangers, jewellery on velvet trays, silk gloves in open drawers. The 40 Elephants read that as an invitation. Their technique for entering a store was called putting on the posh. The women dressed with precision, in expensive and fashionable clothing that told a shopkeeper at a glance that here was a customer of means, a woman to be deferred to rather than watched. Once inside, the work began. Standard hoisting involved concealing items in specially constructed undergarments, bloomers with wide legs elasticated at the knee, into which a fur coat still on its hanger could be rolled and inserted so that nothing showed beneath the skirt. Skilled hoisters could carry out of a store in a single visit goods worth many hundreds of pounds. Other techniques involved what the gang called the crush, in which several women would converge on a counter simultaneously, handling goods, passing them between themselves, confusing the clerk with the volume of hands and the speed of movement, and walking away with items concealed in the process. One method involved pressing jewellery to the underside of a display counter with a piece of chewing gum, then walking away and sending a second woman in minutes later to retrieve it from beneath. The planning and coordination required for operations of that kind, spread across multiple women in multiple locations simultaneously, was not the work of an improvised group. It was the work of an organisation. The code Diamond imposed on that organisation was strict. No drinking before or during an operation. Members went to bed early the night before a planned heist. Relationships had to be vetted by Diamond herself, because a member who married carelessly might marry a man with connections to the police, or a man who talked. When one member married in 1925 without Diamond's approval, Diamond organised a retaliatory attack on the husband. Her gang members arrived at the man's home with bricks and bottles, and the attack turned into a running confrontation with police in the streets around Lambeth. The incident became known locally as the Lambeth Riot. Alice Diamond received 18 months in Holloway Prison for her role in orchestrating it, and 9 of her members received prison sentences alongside her. The operation of the gang slowed during that period, and by the time Diamond was released, someone else had taken the helm. What the gang achieved under Diamond's leadership extended well beyond London. The 40 Elephants conducted raids in Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, Derby and Newcastle, targeting the quality stores of each city with the same precision they applied to the West End. They operated, in the language of a later era, as an organised criminal enterprise with a national footprint. The alliance Diamond maintained with the Elephant and Castle mob, the male gang from the same area run by the MacDonald brothers, gave her operation access to a ready distribution network for the stolen goods. The 40 Elephants took the merchandise, and the male gang's fences moved it. Smaller criminal operations in the territories through which the gang passed were expected to pay tribute on what they stole or face the consequences of the refusal. Diamond ran a form of protection economy layered on top of the hoisting operation itself. Diamond's deputy during the peak years was a woman named Maggie Hughes, known in the press as Babyface, for the sweetness of her appearance, which sat in stark contrast to her reputation. Hughes was red-haired, fond of drink, and capable of violence that alarmed even experienced police officers. During one arrest, she drove a hatpin into the eye of a police officer, blinding him in that eye. When she was sentenced for the offence, standing in the dock, she shouted back at the judge that the sentence would only make her a worse villain. It was not an idle remark. She served the sentence and returned to the gang. The women who made up the 40 Elephants were not incidental participants in someone else's criminal enterprise. They were professionals who understood exactly what they were doing and accepted the occupational risk of incarceration as part of a career calculation. Prison sentences among the gang tended to be short in that era, a year or 3 years of hard labour being the standard tariff for shoplifting, and the women returned to the gang on release as a matter of routine. Ada Wellman, one of the members, was first arrested in 1921 and was still active in the gang when arrested again in 1939. The money the gang generated was spent in ways that attracted attention. Diamond and her senior members dressed expensively, held lavish parties, and moved through South London with the appearance of women who had escaped the poverty their neighbourhood imposed on everyone around them. There was a deliberate theatricality to the lifestyle, and the press coverage that followed the gang reinforced it. The Illustrated News described Diamond and Maggie Hughes as women whose records made one gasp for breath. American newspapers ran stories about the gang under headlines referring to Scotland Yard's attempts to shut them down, positioning the 40 Elephants as an international curiosity. Diamond understood that notoriety was a kind of advertisement, and she appears to have cultivated it without significant concern. The stores of the West End knew who she was, the police knew who she was, she operated regardless. After the 1925 sentence, Diamond's grip on the gang's leadership never fully recovered. She ran an operation for a period after her release, but the landscape had shifted. Fashions had changed, the flapper dresses of the 1920s being far less accommodating to concealed merchandise than the voluminous skirts of the previous generation, and stores had begun employing female store detectives specifically to counter the threat the gang represented. The gang adapted, moving into burglary and smash and grab raids and fraud, but the coherence of the original operation was harder to maintain. Leadership passed eventually to Maggie Hill, the sister of the North London gangster Billy Hill, who kept the organisation running into the 1940s. Hill was arrested in 1939 for blinding a police officer with a hatpin and sentenced to 4 years in Holloway. On her release, she retired from shoplifting entirely. Alice Diamond herself spent her final years running a brothel and died of multiple sclerosis in 1952. The successor who came after Maggie Hill was a woman named Shirley Pitts, born in Lambeth in 1934, who had started stealing food for her family as a child. Pitts had been trained directly by Alice Diamond and by other senior members of the gang in the 1940s, receiving what amounted to a professional education in the techniques the 40 Elephants had refined across 3 decades. The newspapers gave Pitts the title Queen of the Shoplifters, and she carried it for 40 years, a career in professional crime that ran from the post-war period to the 1980s. She knew the Cray brothers, Ronnie Knight and Charlie Wilson. She operated across a changing city, the department stores becoming smarter about surveillance and security, and adapted her methods accordingly. She died in 1992. What the 40 Elephants left behind was not just a criminal record, but something more durable. The proof that a women-only criminal organisation, run by women from South London's most deprived streets, could sustain itself for the better part of a century, resist police pressure across decades, extend its operations nationally, and produce successive generations of leadership without ever collapsing into the pattern the police expected. The police expected that removing the leader would end the gang. Diamond went to Holloway. The gang continued. Hughes was sentenced. The gang continued. The whole architecture of the organisation was designed to survive the removal of its parts. A structure built out of shared economic interest and shared community ties and shared professional knowledge that could not simply be arrested away. It was, in the language of a later era of criminal intelligence, a resilience network. The 40 Elephants were that, long before anyone had a name for the concept. They operated out of the Elephant and Castle, a neighbourhood that expected nothing from them, and they built something that lasted from the 1870s until the last of the queens retired and died. The same streets, the same logic, the same economy of necessity and ambition. London was there throughout. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 40 Elephants ran organised crime out of South London for the better part of a century, a structure built on discipline, shared knowledge, and succession that survived every arrest the police could manage. Next, we move forward in time to a woman who built a very different kind of criminal empire from North London, one that moved nearly a ton of cocaine across the country and put her own family to work doing it. Section 2. Deborah Mason, Queen Bee. Crayford Road in Tufnell Park is a quiet residential street in the borough of Islington, North London, the kind of road that appears unremarkable from outside. Victorian terraces, a short walk from the tube, close enough to Holloway Road that the noise of the city is always present, but never overwhelming. The houses on streets like this one are mostly subdivided now, broken into flats, rented out in sections, the original floor plans long since adapted to the economics of the London rental market. To anyone passing along the pavement, there was nothing about the house on Crayford Road to suggest it was the administrative centre of a cocaine distribution network that would eventually account for nearly a ton of the drug, move it through every major city in England and Wales, and generate revenues estimated by investigators at £80 million. There was nothing to see. That was the point. Deborah Mason was 65 years old when she was arrested. She was a grandmother. She collected £50,000 a year in state benefits. She had been planning a trip to Turkey for cosmetic surgery. She kept a Bengal cat named Ghost, for whom she had purchased a Gucci collar and lead with a 9-carat gold name tag at a cost of £400. She was, on the surface of her life, a pensioner of moderate means living in North London in unremarkable circumstances. Underneath that surface she was running, from her home on Crayford Road, one of the most productive cocaine supply operations the Metropolitan Police had encountered in years. Her associates called her Queen Bee. The title was not ironic. The operation had been running since April 2023, though the foundations of it were built earlier. What Mason constructed was a family enterprise in the most literal sense. She recruited her sister's children, her sister's grandchildren's partners, and their associates, binding them into a network through the ties that are hardest for police intelligence to map because they are not transactional. They are relational. They are built on Christmas dinners and shared histories, and the kind of trust that cannot be created between strangers and cannot easily be broken by pressure from outside. In the structure of organised crime, family networks carry a specific operational advantage. They reduce the number of unfamiliar contacts involved in any given transaction. They make it harder to introduce informants. They create a shared exposure that keeps individual members invested in the group's collective silence. Mason understood that without needing to articulate it. She simply used the family she had. Her sister was Tina Golding, 66 years old at the time of sentencing, living in Beechholm Drive in Ashford, Kent. Golding's 4 children were all drawn in: Roseanne Mason, 29, of Grosvenor Avenue in Canonbury; Demi Bright, 30, of Samuel Peto Way in Ashford; Lily Bright, 26, of Evergreen Way in Ashford; and Reggie Bright, 24, of Frittenden Road in Staplehurst. Reggie Bright recruited his partner, Demi Kendall, 31, who lived with him at the Frittenden Road address. Demi Kendall brought in her friend Anita Slaughter, 44, of Permain Way in Ashford. A young woman named Chloe Hodgkin, 23, of Abbott's Walk in Y, was also involved. In total, 8 individuals were prosecuted, the majority of them women, and the majority of them related to each other by blood or by the intimate ties of partnership. The operation was a family business. The sentencing at Woolwich Crown Court would eventually account for a combined 106 years and 6 months in prison. The mechanics of the supply operation were straightforward, the kind of logistics that leave traces in hired vehicles and digital communications and the records of port authorities. Cocaine was being imported. The entry point was Harwich Port on the Essex coast, a working port that processes freight and passenger traffic from the Hook of Holland and beyond. Someone at the other end of the supply chain was moving consignments of cocaine through that port, hidden in commercial freight, or in ways that the investigation eventually established but never fully disclosed in open court reporting. Mason's role was collection. On the morning of April 20th, 2023, a hired car left Crayford Road at 4:30 in the morning, driven by Mason. It arrived at Harwich Port at approximately 6:20. After 20 minutes at the port, the car turned around and drove back toward London. 20 minutes at Harwich Port is not a sightseeing visit, it is a collection. What was collected on that trip, and on the many subsequent trips, was cocaine in quantities that would total, across the 7 months of the operation from April to November 2023, close to 1 tonne. The distribution side of the operation was what required the network. Packages of imported cocaine left London by hired car, driven by Mason, by her sister, by Tina Golding's children, by Demi Kendall and Anita Slaughter and Chloe Hodgkin. They drove to Bradford, Leicester, Birmingham, Bristol, Cardiff, Rotherham, Southend, Walsall, and points in between. Investigators tracking the movement of the group through call data and conventional surveillance built up a picture of a network operating at pace, with multiple couriers making multiple journeys across the country on a rolling basis. Some of those couriers, on some of those trips, had their young children in the car with them. Reggie Bright was 24 years old. Demi Kendall was 31. The children travelling with them on those runs were as young as 2 years old. A child in a car seat is not a courier. A child in a car seat is a practical consideration, because a car containing a young family is, to a casual observer, a car containing a young family. It is not the obvious profile of a drug delivery vehicle. These calculations were being made. The communication within the group was conducted through Signal, an encrypted messaging platform. Signal is end-to-end encrypted, which means that intercepting the messages requires access to the devices rather than to the network, and it deletes messages by default after whatever period the user sets. When the Metropolitan Police eventually arrested the group in May 2024 and obtained their devices, investigators were confronted with a pattern of deletion that was itself evidentially significant. The Crown Prosecution Service noted in its sentencing statement that the review of thousands of messages had revealed not only incriminating content, where content remained, but also a significant pattern of deletions that demonstrated, in the prosecution's submission, that every member of the group knew precisely what they were doing and was actively working to obscure it. Deleted messages are not innocents. In the context of a drug network, a deleted message is an operational decision. Mason's personal finances during the period of the operation present a picture worth examining slowly. She was collecting state benefits at a rate of approximately £50,000 per year, while running an enterprise that investigators estimated returned more than £1,000 per day to each individual member of the network. The precise total of her personal criminal earnings across the 7 months of the active operation was not broken down publicly in the sentencing reporting, but the mathematics of the broader figure are not complicated. 1 ton of cocaine at wholesale rates represents a sum in the tens of millions of pounds. The £80 million figure attributed to the operation by some reporting represents the street retail value across the full distribution chain. Mason was not at the bottom of that chain. She was collecting from Harwich before dawn. She was directing the couriers. She was the administrative centre. The Gucci collar for the cat. The planned cosmetic surgery in Turkey. The hire cars and hotels expensed to the operation as overheads. These were the visible surface of a financial life that ran well beneath the one her benefit claims described. The defence argument at trial tried to reframe Mason's position within the network. Her barrister, George Payne, submitted to the court that Mason did not look like someone involved in drug dealing, and that this appearance of innocuousness was precisely why she had been chosen to play her role. The submission was that she was a participant without overall control, that she lacked the knowledge and experience of a true principal, and that others above her in the supply chain were directing the operation. The court did not accept this framing. The evidence placed Mason leaving her home at 4:30 in the morning to drive 2 hours to a commercial port, collecting a shipment and returning. It placed her communicating with her network via encrypted messaging. It placed her at the centre of a logistics operation that had been running for 7 months and that had moved quantities of cocaine sufficient to supply a significant fraction of the national market. The jury found her guilty of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs on 28th of April 2025. On 18th July 2025, Woolwich Crown Court sentenced her to 20 years in prison. The sentences handed down to the wider group reflected the court's assessment of each person's operational role and culpability. Tina Golding, 66, received 10 years. Her daughter, Roseanne Mason, received 11 years. Demi Bright received 11 years. Lily Bright received 13 years, having also pleaded guilty separately to a charge of offering to supply Class A drugs identified through the review of her mobile device. Reggie Bright, the youngest member of the adult network, received 15 years and had also pleaded guilty to possession with intent to supply and possession of criminal property following the seizure of cocaine and more than £15,000 in cash from a search of his home address. Demi Kendall received 13 years and 6 months, with similar additional guilty pleas. Anita Slaughter, who had not been arrested in the initial May 2024 operation, but was identified from the message evidence and arrested in November 2024, received 13 years. The combined sentence for the group was 106 years and 6 months. Detective Constable Jack Croushar, who led the Metropolitan Police investigation, described the operation as sophisticated and extremely profitable. The investigation had used what the Met characterised as precision technology, alongside conventional surveillance and extensive call data analysis. The phrase precision technology, in the context of Met investigations of this period, typically encompasses mobile phone tower data, device extraction, and the analytical tools used to map patterns of movement and communication across large data sets. The operation against Mason and her network was months in the making, the kind of patient accumulation of evidence that characterises major drugs investigations, and that results, when it concludes, in a file sufficient to sustain a trial of several months' duration against multiple defendants. The 11-week trial at Woolwich Crown Court was the product of that accumulation. The Robert Hutchinson statement from the Crown Prosecution Service at sentencing drew a particular kind of attention. Hutchinson described Mason as having recruited her relatives to an extraordinarily profitable criminal enterprise, rather than nurturing and caring for them, inverting the role that family is conventionally understood to play. The inversion is real, but it is worth examining the logic underneath it. Mason did not recruit strangers into a criminal venture and expose them to risks they had no reason to anticipate. She recruited people she knew intimately, people who came from the same background, the same circumstances, the same set of economic pressures, and people who were capable of making their own calculations about what the work involved and what it offered. Demi Kendall and Reggie Bright had £15,000 in cash and cocaine in their home address. These were not people who were unaware of the business they were in. The family structure of the network made it more cohesive and more difficult to penetrate, not more innocent. What the Mason operation represents in the history of London's criminal economy is something that becomes clearer in the context of the earlier sections of this list. The 40 Elephants, a century before, had organised themselves on exactly the same logic: family ties, geographical community, shared exposure, structured distribution. Alice Diamond ran her gang on a model of reciprocal obligation and collective interest that bore more resemblance to a close-knit family firm than to the hierarchical criminal enterprises that dominated the male criminal world of the same era. Deborah Mason, driving a hired car through the pre-dawn darkness toward Harwich Port, was operating inside a tradition with a long history in London, even if she was not aware of it. A woman at the centre, a family network radiating outward, a distribution operation covering the country. The scale was different. The logic was the same. She called herself Queen Bee. The title had been claimed before, in South London, by a woman who wore diamond rings on her knuckles and ran the most professional shoplifting operation the West End had ever encountered. The crown passed across generations in ways that no criminal record could easily trace. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Deborah Mason built a cocaine empire worth £80 million from a quiet North London street and drew her own family in around her, and the courts gave her 20 years to think about it. Next we move to a very different kind of case. A woman who killed for financial gain, dismembered her victim, and became the first woman in England to have her life sentence handed down on live television. Section 3. Gemma Mitchell, the Blue Suitcase. Wembley, in the northwest of London, is a borough that most people associate with the stadium and the arch that rises above it, visible from miles away on the approach roads. Away from the stadium and its surrounding plaza, the streets of Wembley are domestic, ordinary, lined with the kind of semi-detached housing that spread across this part of Middlesex in the interwar years, when the suburbs were still expanding and the idea of a house with a garden represented something achievable for a working family. The streets around Chalk Hill Road and its neighbouring turnings have been home to many communities over the decades, the demographics shifting with the waves of migration that reshaped outer London in the post-war period. There is nothing in the physical appearance of those streets that prepares anyone for what happened in one of them on the morning of the 11th of June, 2021. What happened was a premeditated murder for financial gain, carried out by a woman who had spent years training in the anatomy and dissection of the human body, who brought a large blue suitcase with her when she arrived, and who left hours later with the suitcase considerably heavier than it had been when she wheeled it through the front gate. Mi Kuen Chong was 67 years old, a Malaysian woman who had lived in London for many years, divorced, residing in her own home in Wembley. She was known to her friends and her church community as Deborah, and it was through a church group that she had first encountered Gemma Mitchell. Chong had suffered from schizophrenia for a period of her life, and the illness had made her vulnerable in ways that a person with the right disposition could recognise and use. She had written letters to the then Prince of Wales and to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson during a period when her mental health was deteriorating, and she had been referred for professional help. She was not without community. She had a lodger in her house, family members in Malaysia, and the connections that came from her faith. But she was also a woman whose grip on her circumstances was fragile, in ways that someone observant and calculating would notice. Mitchell noticed. Gemma Mitchell had been born in Australia on the 22nd of July 1984. Her mother had worked for the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the family had lived abroad through Mitchell's childhood, before eventually returning to Britain. Mitchell had studied osteopathy, qualified as a practitioner, and set up a practice in Australia before coming back to the United Kingdom in 2015. On her professional website, she had described herself as attuned to subjects in neuroanatomy, genetics, and the dissection of human cadavers, listing expertise in those areas as credentials. The website was an advertisement. In the context of what the prosecution would later establish happened on Chalk Hill Road, the specific language about dissection of human cadavers was not simply professional copy. It was a record of a relevant competency. The judge at sentencing would describe it as a chilling aspect of the case. The court took the view that Mitchell's professional training was not incidental to the manner in which Chong died and in which her body was subsequently handled. The financial context of the murder was established carefully during the trial at the Old Bailey, and it is worth following in detail because without that context, the crime has no shape. Mitchell and her mother shared a large property in Willesden, northwest London, a house valued at approximately £4 million. The property was in a serious state of disrepair and required significant structural renovation, including the addition of another floor. Mitchell and her mother hired 2 builders for the project and were cheated, losing approximately £230,000 to contractors who took the money and failed to complete the work. The loss was catastrophic at the scale of their available capital. Mitchell needed money, and she needed it in a sum large enough to restart the renovation project. Mi Kuen Chong was a property owner. Her estate, including her home in Wembley, was worth approximately £700,000. Chong agreed to give Mitchell £200,000. The two women exchanged numerous text messages on the subject over an extended period, the messages recording the development of what appeared, on Chong's side, to be a genuine act of friendship and generosity toward a woman she had met through her church. Then, in the weeks before June 11, 2021, Chong changed her mind. She withdrew the offer. She told Mitchell she should sell her house instead and use the proceeds. The £200,000 was not coming. In the prosecution's submission to the court, this withdrawal of the promised money was the immediate trigger for what followed. Mitchell did not accept the withdrawal. She had already decided what she was going to do about it. On the morning of June 11, 2021, CCTV cameras on the streets around Chong's home captured Mitchell's arrival. She came on foot, pulling a large blue suitcase behind her. She arrived at the property at around 8 in the morning. More than 4 hours later, at approximately 1:13 in the afternoon, she emerged. The suitcase had been bulkier and heavier when she left than it had been when she arrived. She also carried a smaller bag that was later established to contain Chong's personal financial documents, including papers relating to her estate. Mitchell took a minicab away from the area. She returned to her house in Willesden. What she brought with her into that house was the body of Mi Kuen Chong, decapitated. The prosecution's case was that Mitchell killed Chong inside the property, likely by striking her over the head with a blunt instrument, that she then used her knowledge of human anatomy and her professed skill in dissection to remove the head from the body, and that she concealed Chong's remains within the blue suitcase and transported them back to her own home. She kept the body in the garden of the Willesden house for approximately 2 weeks. During that fortnight, Mitchell was composing a cover story. She sent a WhatsApp message to Chong's lodger saying that Chong had gone to spend time with family for a year, that she wanted to clear her head, that she planned to stay somewhere close to the ocean. On June 30th, after reports had begun circulating that an unidentified body had been found in Devon, Mitchell sent a false report to a missing persons charity, claiming that Chong had been in contact with her to say she felt neglected and had gone to be with loved ones by the sea. The message was sent to make the discovery of a body in Devon consistent with a voluntary disappearance rather than a crime. It was sent 4 days after the body had already been found. Mitchell was tracking the investigation in real time and responding to it. This was not panic, it was management. On the 26th of June 2021, Mitchell loaded Chong's remains into the blue suitcase, put the suitcase into the boot of a hire car, and drove south and west out of London. The route took her approximately 200 miles toward the coastal town of Salcombe in Devon, a small and picturesque sailing and holiday town tucked into the estuary of the Kingsbridge River in the South Hams district. At some point during the journey, one of the hire car's tyres blew out. Mitchell pulled into a service station and called for assistance. CCTV cameras at the service station recorded her presence there. This became one of the pieces of evidence placing her on the route to the disposal site. The tyre was changed or the car was replaced, and she continued to Salcombe. She drove to a woodland footpath near the town, and she left the body there in the overgrowth beside the path. She left the head several metres away. Holidaymakers discovered the remains the following day, 27th June, beside the path in the woods outside Salcombe. The body was badly decomposed, the result of 2 weeks of storage in the garden of the Willesden house during summer. The head had been separated. Identification was not possible for several days. A post-mortem examination found skull fractures consistent with a blow to the head and broken ribs consistent with the body having been compressed into the suitcase. The examination also determined that the removal of the head was not the result of animal activity and had been carried out by a person. Forensic pathology confirmed what the prosecution had already inferred from the evidence of Mitchell's movements. When police identified the remains as those of Mi Kuen Chong and traced her last known contact, they found Mitchell. She was arrested at her home in Willesden on 6th July 2021. During the search of the property, officers found a forged copy of Mi Kuen Chong's will. The document left approximately 95% of Chong's estate to Mitchell. The forgery had been constructed using identity documents belonging to a recently deceased neighbour, whose papers Mitchell had retained after the neighbour's death in May 2021. Those documents were used to name the neighbour as a witness to the forged will, a witness who could not be questioned because she was already dead. A mobile phone belonging to the same deceased neighbour had been reactivated and used to hire the car in which Chong's body had been transported to Devon. The planning across these individual decisions was extensive and interlocking. Each element was designed to address a specific evidential problem: establishing a plausible account of Chong's disappearance, forging a document that would redirect her estate, hiring a vehicle in a name other than Mitchell's own, and disposing of the body at a sufficient distance from London to complicate the investigation's geographical focus. During her time in custody before trial, Mitchell declined to answer questions. She was charged with murder on July 9, 2021. Her trial at the Old Bailey in Courtroom 12 was delayed from its original September 2022 date by the strike action being taken by members of the Criminal Bar Association that autumn, and began eventually on 11th October 2022. The case was prosecuted by Deanna Heer, KC. The defence was led by Richard Jory, KC. Mitchell declined to give evidence at her trial. A jury watched CCTV footage of a woman arriving at a property with an empty suitcase and leaving with a heavy one. They heard the evidence of the forged will, the false reports, the stolen identity documents, the post-mortem findings, the hired car on the route to Salcombe. They heard that the blue suitcase, recovered from the roof of a neighbour's shed at Mitchell's address, contained no forensic evidence attributable to the body because it had been cleaned, but did contain a blood-stained tea towel in one of its pockets, and on that tea towel was Mi Kuen Chong's DNA. 7 hours of deliberation was enough. The jury returned a guilty verdict on 27th of October 2022. The sentencing took place the following day, 28th of October, in the same courtroom at the Old Bailey. It was the second time in the history of the English courts that cameras had been permitted in a Crown Court for the purposes of broadcasting a sentencing, and the first time that a woman had been sentenced for murder on live television in England and Wales. Judge Richard Marks KC sat on the bench and addressed a court that knew it was being filmed. The sentencing remarks described the murder as a particularly shocking crime, carried out by an extremely devious person for the purpose of financial gain. The judge noted the chilling nature of what had been done to the body, the forethought involved in bringing the suitcase, the cold management of the aftermath across 2 weeks of concealment, the false reports, the forged documents, and the attempt to use a dead neighbour's identity as cover. He said Mitchell had shown absolutely no remorse and appeared to be in complete denial about what the evidence had proved beyond doubt. He sentenced her to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years. Mitchell stood impassively as the sentence was delivered. Mi Kwun Chong's sister, watching the sentencing via video link from Malaysia, had a statement read to the court on her behalf. She said she still did not understand how Deborah had died, whether she had suffered, and that the mystery would haunt her forever. Detective Chief Inspector Jim Eastwood, who led the investigation, spoke outside court about the only motive that the evidence established clearly, which was money. Mitchell had needed £200,000, had been offered it, had seen the offer withdrawn, and had decided to take the £700,000 estate instead. The forged will was the plan, the murder was the mechanism, the dissection was the means of transport. Every step was ordered by the same logic. Mitchell's professional background is an element of this case that courts rarely have to consider. The training in human anatomy that she had documented so carefully on her professional website was not a peripheral detail. It was a functional qualification applied to an act of violence. The decapitation of a body is not a straightforward task, and the evidence established that Mitchell had carried it out with a degree of competence that reflected her years of study and practice in the mechanics of the human body. That competence was the reason she had been able to move the remains, compact them into a standard piece of luggage, and transport them 200 miles to a disposal site without the luggage visibly failing under the weight or the stress of the journey. The skills she had advertised publicly were the skills she used privately. The court noted it. The judge called it chilling. That word appears in the sentencing remarks because there was no less clinical one that accurately describes what it means for a professional training to be turned toward a premeditated killing and the management of its aftermath. She will not be eligible for parole consideration until she is at least 72 years old. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gemma Mitchell planned a murder for financial gain, carried it out with professional precision, and managed the aftermath across 2 weeks before the evidence caught up with her. The life sentence she received at the Old Bailey made history for reasons the court had not anticipated. Next, we move to a woman whose crimes were financial rather than violent, but whose reach inside London's criminal economy was so vast that authorities spent 9 years hunting her across 2 continents before they found her walking her dogs in a Spanish coastal town. Section 4. Sarah Panitsky, the billion-pound fugitive. Santa Barbara is a small municipality in the province of Tarragona, in the southern reaches of Catalonia, about 20 kilometres inland from the coast and roughly equidistant between Valencia and Barcelona. It sits in the Terra Alta wine country, a landscape of terraced vineyards and limestone ridges, and villages where the population numbers in the hundreds rather than the thousands. The streets are quiet, the rhythms are agricultural. It is not the kind of place that features in criminal intelligence reports, not a place associated with the financial crimes of the City of London, or the fraud investigation units of HM Revenue and Customs, or the international wanted lists of the National Crime Agency. On the morning of February 27, 2022, plainclothes officers from Spain's Guardia Civil had been conducting surveillance on an apartment block in the town for several weeks. That morning, they identified a woman leaving her home for her daily walk with her dogs. They confirmed her identity against the details on the UK arrest warrant they had been working from. They approached her in a rural area near the building and placed her in custody without resistance. Her name was Sarah Panitsky. She had been on the run for 8 years and 9 months. She was Britain's most wanted woman, and she had been hiding in a village of fewer than 1,000 people, walking her dogs every morning, apparently convinced that the distance and the quiet had put her beyond reach. Sarah Panitsky was born on March 3, 1974, and grew up in York in the north of England, the product of a comfortable background. She attended St Peter's School in York an independent school where annual fees at the time of her arrest topped £19,000. The kind of institution that produces lawyers and doctors and civil servants, and occasionally, with a different set of decisions, something else. She went on to study at university without completing her degree. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her during those years, a person with a strong orientation toward money and toward the kind of lifestyle that money makes available. A former school friend, speaking to sources after her arrest, described her as someone for whom the presence of significant money would have been a powerful motivator, someone who had grown up with a car, an allowance, and the assumption of comfort, and who would have found the removal of those things difficult to accept. Whether that characterization fully explains what came next is an open question. What is documented is the trajectory. The criminal network Panitska joined was built around a form of fraud known as missing trader intra-community fraud, referred to in financial crime investigation as MTIC fraud, and colloquially as carousel fraud because of the circular motion at its centre. The mechanics of the fraud exploit the rules governing VAT on goods traded between member states of the European Union. Under the relevant rules, goods can be imported into the UK free of VAT, and when those goods are then exported, the exporting company can reclaim from HMRC the VAT that would have been charged on a domestic sale. The fraud constructs a chain of companies, all controlled by the same criminal network, that appears to import and then export goods, most commonly mobile phones in this period, because of their high value relative to their physical size. Each company in the chain charges VAT to the next company, generating a paper trail of tax paid. But because the goods are circling within a controlled network, rather than genuinely moving through an open market, the VAT is never actually paid to the government. When the chain reaches its end, and the exporting company claims the VAT back from HMRC, it is claiming a refund of tax that was never collected. The network then dissolves the company before HMRC can investigate, sets up new companies, and runs the carousel again. The operation that Panitsky was part of ran this fraud at a scale that HMRC investigators described as extraordinary. At one point, during the peak of the network's activity, the volume of mobile phones being purchased and exported by the group in a single month exceeded the total legitimate trade in mobile phones across the entire country during the same period. The figures were not plausible as genuine commercial activity, and the network's legal counsel later acknowledged at trial that any close inspection would have revealed the implausibility immediately. The network protected itself from close inspection by moving with speed, by using a banking platform that allowed a single controlling person to transfer enormous sums up and down the supply chain without losing control of the cash, and by generating the appearance of legitimate business through a volume of paperwork that was real in its detail, even if fraudulent in its foundation. The total estimated value of the fraud, including the laundering operation built around it, was approximately £1 billion. Panitsky's role was near the top of the operation's financial architecture. She was in charge of the company's accounts. She had access to offshore banking infrastructure in Dubai, Spain, and Andorra, and she used those platforms to clean the money the network was extracting from HMRC. She used generated IP addresses to maintain the untraceable character of their online operations. She was, in the specific technical sense that financial crime investigators use, a money launderer, the person whose job is to take criminally derived funds and move them through enough legitimate appearing transactions that the funds lose their visible connection to the crime that generated them. The confiscation order eventually made against her in her absence in March 2016 quantified her personal share of the criminal proceeds at £2,455,913. That figure represented the amount the court was satisfied she had personally benefited from, and it was the amount she was ordered to repay, with a default sentence of 9 years imprisonment if she failed to do so within 3 months. She had been gone for nearly 3 years by the time the confiscation order was made. No money was ever paid. By the time of her eventual extradition, the outstanding sum, including accumulated interest, had reached £3,470,575, accruing at a rate of £538 per day. She had walked out of Britain in May 2013, midway through her trial at Kingston Crown Court for money laundering offences. The decision to flee was made while the trial was still underway. On some date in that month, she left the country and did not return. Her co-defendants, 17 of them in total, remained for trial. They were convicted. She was convicted in her absence. The sentences handed down across the group totaled 135 years. In absentia, Panitsky was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment. The confiscation order followed in 2016. The National Crime Agency placed her on its most wanted list. She became, and remained for 6 consecutive years, the only woman on that list. 21 names in total, fraudsters and drug lords and murderers and paedophiles, and among them, one woman, staring out of her custody photograph with what sources described as the smallest hint of a smile. The 9 years she spent as a fugitive did not appear to have been years of obvious hardship. She lived in Spain, eventually settling in the Tarragona region under a false identity. She was not living rough. She was not moving constantly between safe houses or sleeping in borrowed accommodation or surviving on criminal contacts in the underworld. She was living quietly in a small municipality in wine country, walking her dogs in the morning, maintaining what appears from the outside to have been an ordinary routine. How she financed that routine was not established in detail in open reporting. The confiscation order made in her absence suggests that the money she had personally extracted from the fraud was substantial, and £3 million, even shrinking slowly through the cost of maintaining a false identity and an ordinary life, goes a significant distance in rural Catalonia. The NCA had appealed repeatedly for information about her whereabouts in the years since 2013. A number of most wanted appeals had been issued. Her photograph had been circulated. At some point in early 2022, intelligence reached the NCA that narrowed the geography of her location sufficiently to allow Spanish authorities to begin active surveillance. The operation that resulted in her arrest was a joint effort between the NCA, HMRC's Fraud Investigation Service, and the Guardia Civil. Tom Dowdall, the NCA's International Deputy Director, said in a statement following the arrest that Panitsky might have thought, given the length of time, that the agency had stopped looking. The statement reflected something that investigators in this field say in various forms after fugitive arrests, that the operational tempo of a hunt is not always visible from the outside, and that the absence of visible activity does not mean the absence of activity. Simon York, the director of HMRC's Fraud Investigation Service, described her in a statement as one of Britain's most wanted tax fugitives, and said she had played a pivotal role in a multi-million-pound VAT fraud and had moved millions through offshore bank accounts while thinking she had placed herself outside HMRC's reach. The language of that statement is worth noting. This was HMRC speaking, not the police. The primary crime was fiscal. The primary injury was to the public revenue. The investigation had spanned 2 agencies, required international cooperation, and taken the better part of a decade to conclude. The arrest of a woman walking her dogs in a small Spanish town was its resolution. Panitsky was extradited to the United Kingdom and appeared at Kingston Crown Court in southwest London in June 2022. The extradition proceedings had followed the arrest, and she had contested them, or her representatives had, in the standard manner available to persons subject to European arrest warrants. She lost the extradition challenge and was returned to Britain. At Kingston Crown Court, the original 8-year sentence from her conviction in absentia was confirmed. She began serving that sentence. In March 2023, the City of London Magistrates Court addressed the outstanding confiscation order. Because no money had been paid against the order and the default period had long expired, the court added a further 9 years to her sentence. Her total term became 17 years. Whether the confiscation order will ever be satisfied in financial terms remains unclear. The outstanding sum continues to accrue interest. The broader fraud of which Panitsky was a part sits within a category of crime that is less immediately visceral than drug trafficking or violence, but that operates at a scale and with a systemic reach that the more dramatic categories rarely match. £1 billion extracted from the public revenue through carousel fraud is money that is not available for public services, for infrastructure, for the NHS procurement budgets that pay for the equipment in hospital wards, for the welfare payments that reach the people who need them. The mechanism is invisible, and the harm is diffuse in a way that makes it easy to underestimate, but the accounting is real. 17 defendants other than Panitsky were convicted for their roles in the same network. The sentences totaled 135 years. The Serious Organised Crime Agency, which became the NCA in 2013, assessed the network as one of the most damaging single carousel fraud operations it had investigated. The damage was done before anyone was arrested. The prosecution undid the impunity, not the loss. Women made up approximately 19% of those convicted of VAT fraud in the United Kingdom across the period captured by Ministry of Justice data, according to an analysis verified in the years before Panitska's arrest. The rarity of women in this category of serious economic crime meant that Panitska occupied a particular position in the NCA's operational consciousness. She was not simply the most wanted person on the list who happened to be a woman. She was a specific kind of anomaly. A woman at or near the top of a sophisticated financial crime network, managing offshore accounts across 3 jurisdictions, using technical tools to maintain untraceability, and making the decision to run at the precise moment when the weight of the prosecution's case became clear. That decision to flee mid-trial, rather than face the verdict, reflects a calculation about risk that was in keeping with the analytical orientation the network required of its senior members. Running was an operational decision made by a person who understood what the evidence showed and what the sentence was likely to be. She was right about the sentence. She was wrong about the reach. The Guardia Civil officers who apprehended her in the rural area near her home in Santa Barbara did so, by all accounts, without drama. She was taken into custody peacefully. The dogs were presumably seen to. 9 years of an ordinary-seeming life in the Catalan countryside ended in a morning, the way these things tend to end when the surveillance has been patient and the intelligence has been sufficient. She was 57 years old when she was extradited back to Britain. She will be in her mid-60s at the earliest, before the first of her sentences is served. The confiscation order, accumulating its £538 a day, will be waiting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sarah Panitsky spent 9 years as the only woman on Britain's most wanted list, and was eventually found in a Spanish village where she had been hiding in plain sight. Next, we move to a different kind of fraud, one that did not involve offshore accounts or European Union trading rules, but that managed to extract more than £50 million from the British welfare system through a network of forged documents, shell companies, and benefit factories operating out of North London. Section 5. Galina Nikolova, the benefit factories. Wood Green Crown Court sits on Woodall House in the London borough of Haringey, a mid-sized court complex handling the criminal cases generated by North and North East London. It is not the Old Bailey. It does not carry the weight of that building's centuries of criminal history, does not have the same architecture of formal severity, does not generate the same volume of national press attention for the cases that pass through it. Cases tried at Wood Green tend to be serious crimes committed in the communities the court serves, processed by a system that is mostly invisible to people who have no reason to encounter it. On 28th of May 2024, Wood Green Crown Court sentenced 5 defendants who had pleaded guilty to fraud and money laundering offences arising from what the Crown Prosecution Service and the Department for Work and Pensions both described as the largest benefit fraud prosecution ever brought to the courts in England and Wales. The total value of the fraudulent claims was £53,901,959.82. The precision of that final 82 pence is not an accident. It reflects the nature of the investigation, a forensic accounting exercise conducted across thousands of individual transactions, each one a false universal credit claim, each one a piece of a structure that had been running inside London for nearly 5 years. The 5 defendants were all Bulgarian nationals. They were Galina Nikolova, born May 10th, 1985, who was 39 at the time of sentencing; Stoyan Stoyanov, born May 8th, 1996, who was 28; Svetka Todorova, born May 20th, 1971, who was 53; Gunesh Ali, born March 6th, 1990, who was 34; and Patricia Paneva, born May 15th, 1997, who was 27. All 5 had pleaded guilty to their respective charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and money laundering related offences. The guilty pleas came at different stages of the proceedings, ranging from Paneva's plea in June 2023 to Nikolova's on April 5th, 2024, and they came in the face of what the prosecution described as overwhelming evidence accumulated over a lengthy and complex investigation. The judge at Wood Green sentenced Nikolova to 8 years, Stoyanov to 4 years, Todorova to 3 years, Ali to 7 years and 3 months, and Paneva to 3 years and 2 months. To understand what the network actually did, it helps to begin with universal credit, the welfare benefit that replaced a range of previous means-tested payments when the Department for Work and Pensions rolled it out nationally across the 2010s. Universal credit is administered digitally through an online portal, and claims are assessed on the basis of information provided by the claimant and supporting documentation. The system was designed for accessibility, for simplicity of the application process, and for speed of payment. A person who loses a job or suffers a sudden drop in income can apply online, provide the necessary documents, and receive a payment relatively quickly if the claim is accepted. Those design features, which serve the legitimate purpose of getting money to people who need it as fast as possible, also created a surface that a sufficiently organised fraud network could exploit at scale. The Nikolova network understood those vulnerabilities and built an industrial operation around them. The fraud ran from October 2016 to May 2021, a period of 4 years and 7 months. During that time, the group made thousands of false claims for universal credit, using a combination of real individuals whose identities they had obtained and entirely fabricated identities constructed from scratch. Each claim required supporting documentation, evidence of address, evidence of employment or the lack of it, evidence of income, evidence of dependence in some cases. All of this documentation was forged. The network produced false tenancy agreements showing claimants at residential addresses they did not occupy. It produced counterfeit payslips showing employment histories that did not exist. It produced forged letters from landlords, from employers, and from general practitioners, each document constructed to pass the basic verification checks the DWP applied to incoming claims. When a claim was rejected, the network did not abandon it. It modified the documentation and tried again, persistent in the way that a commercial operation pursuing revenue rather than a desperate individual pursuing a single payment would be persistent. The phrase the prosecution and DWP used for the locations from which this activity was coordinated was benefit factories. 3 of them have been identified in London during the investigation. A benefit factory, in the specific sense the investigators applied to these locations, was a premises that had the outward appearance of a legitimate business, but whose actual function was the industrial production of fraudulent benefit claims. Inside these premises, the network generated the paperwork infrastructure for thousands of applications, the false tenancy agreements, the counterfeit payslips, the forged professional correspondence. The claims would then be submitted, the money would flow into bank accounts controlled by or accessible to the network, and the money would be laundered from those accounts through a sequence of transfers and cash withdrawals designed to obscure its origin. The investigators tracking the operation found, when they executed searches of the defendants' addresses in May 2021, a physical record of this process that was difficult to misinterpret. They found hundreds of what they described as claim packs, physical folders or collections of documents prepared for use in individual false claims, each pack containing forged bank statements, fake photographic identification, and fabricated information on dependents. These were pre-assembled fraud kits, ready for deployment, sitting in residential properties alongside the other detritus of the defendants' daily lives. Also found during the searches were bundles of cash stuffed into shopping bags and suitcases, designer goods including watches, jackets and jewellery, a luxury car. The seizures told a story about how the proceeds of a fraud that extracted money from a welfare system designed for the most vulnerable people in the country were being spent by the people running it. Universal credit exists to prevent destitution. The money the network took from it bought Gucci and high-end timepieces. The prosecution at Wood Green made this inversion explicit. Ben Reed, the specialist prosecutor for the Crown Prosecution Service, described the defendants as having enriched themselves from government funds designed to protect and help the most vulnerable people in society. The enrichment was substantial. £53 million across 5 years represents an average extraction of roughly £10 million per year, sustained over the entire period of operation without triggering sufficient scrutiny to halt the claims until the investigation was already well advanced. Galina Nikolova was the senior figure in the network, the defendant who received the heaviest sentence and who the evidence placed at the centre of the operation's coordination. Her plea to fraud and money laundering charges at Wood Green in April 2024 came after a lengthy investigation that had required international cooperation. The investigation had been conducted jointly between DWP investigators, the Crown Prosecution Service, and Bulgarian authorities, with Eurojust, the European Union's Agency for Criminal Justice Cooperation, facilitating the joint investigation team established between the UK and Bulgaria. That international dimension was not incidental. The network's membership was Bulgarian, and some of its operational threads extended back to Bulgaria, making the investigation one that could not be concluded through domestic police work alone. The arrests of the 5 defendants began in May 2021, when DWP investigators and police executed searches at multiple addresses simultaneously and took the majority of the group into custody. One of the 5 defendants did not stay in custody. Gunesh Ali, after being released under investigation, left the United Kingdom for Bulgaria. He was not there when the prosecution was ready to proceed against him. The process of bringing him back required extradition proceedings between the UK and Bulgaria, facilitated by the collaborative structure the joint investigation team had established. Ali was extradited back to the United Kingdom on February 25, 2023. He eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 7 years and 3 months, the second heaviest sentence in the group. The flight to Bulgaria and the subsequent extradition added approximately 2 years to the time between his arrest and his sentencing, time during which the investigation continued and the evidence base was further consolidated. It did not, in the end, help him. The WhatsApp messages recovered from the defendant's devices were a significant part of the prosecution's evidence. The messages showed the defendants communicating about the claims they were processing, sharing forged documents, confirming the status of individual applications, and tracking payments. They also showed the deletion of messages, a pattern familiar from other organised crime prosecutions of this period, in which encrypted messaging and deliberate digital housekeeping are standard operational practice. In the Deborah Mason cocaine case, the pattern of deletion was treated as evidence of knowledge and intent. At Wood Green, the WhatsApp evidence served a similar function, not just as a record of what the network was doing, but as a demonstration that those doing it understood the nature of what they were doing and were taking steps to limit the evidence trail it would leave. Fraud at this scale is not committed by accident. It is committed through sustained, organised effort across years, with deliberate concealment woven into the process from the beginning. The timeline of the fraud is worth holding in mind as a structural fact. The operation began in October 2016 and ran until May 2021. Universal Credit had been expanding its national rollout throughout this period, and the DWP was managing an enormous volume of claims across a system that was still embedding its verification processes. The network operated for the entirety of that period without triggering a shutdown. £53 million left the public revenue over 4.5 years before the investigation reached a point where arrests were made. Understanding why it took that long requires understanding something about the nature of fraud detection at scale. The DWP processes millions of legitimate claims, and the fraudulent ones were constructed specifically to resemble legitimate ones at the level of documentation. The sophistication of the forgery operation, producing claim packs that passed basic document verification, was precisely what made the detection task difficult. It was not that the system was uninspected, it was that the inspection was designed to catch simpler frauds, and the benefit factories were operating above that threshold. What the investigation eventually built its case on was pattern analysis. Individual claims might pass document verification, but when investigators began mapping the sources of claims, looking at the addresses from which applications were being submitted, the bank accounts into which payments were flowing, and the identity documents attached to multiple claims, the industrial character of the operation became visible. Multiple claims linked to single addresses that were not residential properties. Multiple claimed identities linked to single bank accounts. Payslips and tenancy agreements that shared formatting characteristics. The digital fingerprints of documents produced from the same template rather than from genuinely diverse sources. This kind of pattern analysis is the investigative tool that fraud operations at scale cannot easily defeat, because the volume of output that makes the fraud profitable is also the volume that leaves statistical traces. The benefit factories generated hundreds of claim packs, all produced in the same location, using the same templates, eventually produce a signature that is legible to investigators who are looking for it. The DWP's announcement of the convictions placed the case in the context of the department's broader anti-fraud work. The government noted that DWP had saved at least £18 billion in 2022 and 2023 through fraud and error reduction programs, and the Nikolova case was presented as both a prosecution success and a demonstration of the system's capacity to identify and pursue organised fraud at the highest scale. That framing is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not fully account for what was lost in the period before the investigation concluded. £53 million extracted from a welfare system across 4.5 years is not recovered when the defendants are sentenced. The confiscation proceedings that follow criminal convictions of this type attempt to identify and recover assets representing the proceeds of crime. But the cash found stuffed in bags and suitcases at the defendants' addresses was a fraction of the total. What happened to the rest of £53 million? How much was spent? How much was moved offshore? How much remained recoverable? Was a question that the sentencing hearing at Wood Green did not fully answer in its public dimension. Svetka Todorova, at 53 the oldest defendant in the group, after Nikolova's 48 co-conspirators had been sentenced, received 3 years. Patricia Panova, at 27 the youngest, received 3 years and 2 months, having pleaded guilty the earliest of the 5 in June 2023. The range of sentences across the group, from 3 years to 8, reflected the prosecution's and the court's assessment of each individual's operational role, their proximity to the coordination centre of the fraud, and their personal benefit from it. Nikolova, at the top of the hierarchy, received the sentence that reflected the totality of her role across the entire duration of the operation. She was the person who had organised a fraud that ran from 2016 to 2021, generated claim packs in industrial quantities, corrupted the identity infrastructure of thousands of individuals whose details were used without their knowledge, and extracted £53 million from a fund intended to keep the most vulnerable members of society from destitution. 8 years was the court's answer to that. The case holds a particular place in the record of British financial crime, not because of its violence, which was absent, or its geography, which was confined to a set of North London premises and a Bulgarian connection, but because of its scale. No benefit fraud prosecution in England and Wales had previously reached this figure. The benefit factories of North London, wherever precisely they were located across the 3 identified sites, had processed a volume of fraudulent claims that exceeded what anyone had previously managed to organise in this category of crime. In the annals of things that London has been the setting for, a network generating more than £50 million from forged welfare documents is not what the city's criminal reputation is built on. It does not have the drama of the 40 elephants or the violence of a life sentence handed down at the Old Bailey. It is quieter than that. It is paperwork and WhatsApp messages and a luxury car and cash in a shopping bag. It is, nevertheless, £53 million. The precision of that 82 pence at the end of the total is the precision of people who counted every claim and every payment and every document. The same precision the network used to construct it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The benefit factories in North London extracted £53 million from a welfare system over 4.5 years, the largest fraud of its kind ever prosecuted in England and Wales. Next, we move to a very different kind of exploitation. A woman who ran a network of brothels across East London, trafficking women from Bulgaria with the promise of legitimate work and delivering them to a life of forced prostitution controlled by violence and the threat of it. Section this. Eleonora Vasilieva, the Controlled Women Custom House, is a neighbourhood in the London borough of Newham, east of the city and south of the A13, named after the old customs post that once stood on the bank of the Thames before the docks were built and the shoreline changed. Today it sits between the Royal Docks and the Beckton Expressway, a low-rise residential area of mixed housing and small businesses, not far from the Excel Exhibition Centre and the approaches to London City Airport. Alnwick Road, a residential street in Custom House, runs between the larger arteries that move traffic through this part of East London. On March 5, 2019, officers from the Metropolitan Police's Modern Slavery and Kidnap Unit arrived at an address on Anik Road and waited. They were waiting for a man named Ilya Mikhailov, who had been under surveillance as part of an investigation that had begun 13 months earlier, in February 2018, when the Bulgarian authorities sent intelligence to Scotland Yard describing an organised crime network operating in London and exploiting people who had been brought from Bulgaria to the city under false pretences. When Mikhailov emerged from the front door of the address and began to leave, the officers moved. Inside the address, also arrested that morning, was the woman who had built and run the enterprise. Her name was Eleonora Vasileva. She was 34 years old. The operation she had constructed over the previous 2 years had trafficked at least 6 women from Bulgaria to London and had held them in brothels in Woodford Green, Stratford and Leighton, forcing them to have sex with any client on demand, 24 hours a day, without the right to refuse, and requiring them to sell cocaine to customers as an additional source of revenue for the network. On the day of her arrest, she denied involvement. The denial did not survive the trial. Understanding what Vasileva built requires understanding what the women she trafficked were told before they came. The recruitment end of the operation, the point at which the network made contact with potential victims in Bulgaria and persuaded them to travel to the United Kingdom, worked through the same mechanism that most labour trafficking operations use when operating across borders. A promise of legitimate employment, plausible and specific enough to seem credible to a person with limited options and a genuine need. The women approached by the network were told that work was available in London, that the conditions would be adequate, that the situation would be better than what they were leaving behind. The details of what the legitimate employment was supposed to be were not preserved in the public reporting of the case in granular form, but the broader pattern of how these operations present themselves to potential victims in origin countries is consistent across many documented cases. Domestic work, hospitality, cleaning, care, something that a working-age woman without specialist qualifications might reasonably expect to be able to do in a foreign city, for wages that would be meaningful at exchange rates and that would justify the disruption of relocation. The offer sounds real because it is constructed to sound real. The people making it have made it before and know which details close the deal. The moment the women arrived in London, the reality imposed itself immediately. Vasileva's network had arranged for them to be met at the airport. The meeting was presented as a service, as assistance with the transition to a new city by people who knew how things worked. The fee for that service was £200, payable upon arrival, a cost that the women were presumably not expecting, and that placed them in debt to the network from the first moment of contact on British soil. The £200 was not a fee for a service, it was the first mechanism of control, a financial obligation that the network held over the women before they had been in the country long enough to find their bearings or make any other arrangements. From the airport, they were taken to rented properties that Vasileva had sourced and paid for in advance, the organised infrastructure of the operation making clear that none of this was improvised. Everything was already in place before the women arrived. The properties used as brothels were rented addresses in 3 locations: the Broadway in Woodford Green, on the outer northeastern edge of the borough of Redbridge, West Ham Lane in Stratford, in the heart of Newham, and an address in Leighton in Waltham Forest. The geographical spread of the locations across different boroughs was practical rather than incidental. Operating across multiple local authority areas and multiple police borough boundaries complicated any single jurisdiction's ability to develop a comprehensive picture of the operation from the evidence available to it locally. The premises themselves were rented, which meant that the financial exposure of the network was limited. No property ownership that could be traced or confiscated, no mortgage payments that would show up in banking records as a fixed cost, just tenancy agreements in names that may or may not have corresponded to the actual occupants. The properties were what the women's world shrank to. They were rarely allowed to leave them. The conditions in those properties were established during the trial at Snaresbrook Crown Court through the testimony of the women who had lived and worked inside them, and those conditions were not compatible with the term work in any meaningful sense. The women were expected to be available to clients at any hour of the day or night. They were expected to accept any client who presented himself, without the option of refusal. They were expected to sell cocaine to customers as part of the service the properties offered, adding a Class A drug supply operation to the sexual exploitation that was the core business. They were subject to a system of fines imposed by the network when they failed to meet the conditions imposed on them, conditions that included purchasing their own consumables, including condoms, at prices set by the network and inflated above any market rate. They were given no access to medical facilities. They were not permitted to leave the properties freely or for any substantial period. Their money was controlled. The advertising for the properties was controlled and paid for by Vasileva, who organised the online platforms through which clients made contact. The women's labour generated revenue. The network took the substantial majority of it, leaving the women with a small portion from which they were then required to service the debts the network accumulated against them through the rent charges, the fine system, and the inflated prices for consumables. The design of the financial structure was such that the women could not easily earn their way out of it. That was the point. Mikhailov was the network's enforcer. His function within the operation was to manage the compliance of the women through the application or the threat of violence, and to deal with situations in which individual women attempted to resist the conditions imposed on them. The evidence at trial established that he held a disguised stun gun, a weapon prohibited under UK law, the kind of device that can deliver an incapacitating electric shock and that is useful specifically in the context of controlling individuals at close range who might otherwise resist. He was convicted of possessing it. He was also convicted of additional offences that illustrated the texture of his enforcement role in specific detail. One of the women had told Mikhailov that she wanted to return to Bulgaria. She was not asking for permission to renegotiate the terms of her situation. She was trying to leave. Mikhailov's response was to steal £7,500 from her and to threaten to kill her. He was convicted of both the theft and the making of threats to kill. The theft was not random opportunism. It was a punishment and a practical barrier. Without money, leaving becomes harder. The threat was a reinforcement of what the money had already communicated. She was not free to go. The investigation that exposed the network began in February 2018, when Bulgarian law enforcement agencies contacted the Metropolitan Police with intelligence describing the operation. The Met's Modern Slavery and Kidnap Unit took on the case, establishing a joint investigation with Bulgarian police and securing assistance from Europol, based in The Hague, to coordinate the international dimension of the inquiry. The structure of the investigation reflects something important about how this category of crime actually functions. The trafficking networks that move people between countries for exploitation are not domestic operations that happen to cross borders. They are inherently transnational, built on recruitment in one country, transit and exploitation in another, and they can only be fully understood and effectively prosecuted when the law enforcement response matches that transnational character. The Bulgarian intelligence that triggered the investigation was not supplementary context. It was the essential starting point, the moment at which the network became visible to the agencies with the power to act against it. The 13 months between the start of the investigation in February 2018 and the arrests in March 2019 were months of evidence accumulation. Officers tracked the movements of the principals and documented the operation of the brothels through surveillance and intelligence. By the time they arrived at Anik Road on March 5, 2019, the evidential foundation for the prosecution was already substantial. Mikhailov was arrested as he left the address. Vasileva was arrested inside it. Marian Ninov Vasilev, 34, of the Broadway in Woodford Green, the third defendant, was arrested on the same day at the Woodford address, where the network operated one of its brothels. Searches of the three locations yielded cash, Class A drugs, and the disguised stun gun. The physical evidence, combined with the surveillance record and the intelligence shared through the joint investigation team, gave the prosecution a case that the defendants, in their initial responses to the police, denied entirely. The denial was consistent across all three. All three maintained it through the investigation period. All three were tried at Snaresbrook Crown Court, the East London Crown Court that handles cases from Newham, Redbridge, Waltham Forest, and the surrounding area. The trial ran through September 2019, and on 7th October, the jury returned its verdicts. All three defendants were convicted of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, conspiracy to control prostitution for gain, and conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. Mikhailov was additionally convicted of theft, making threats to kill, and possession of a prohibited weapon, in the form of the disguised stun gun. The courage required of the women who came forward to give evidence against the network was considerable. They had been told, as trafficking victims routinely are, that the network's reach extended beyond the brothel walls, that there were consequences for those who cooperated with police, that the threat did not end with an arrest. The detective constable who led the investigation described the victims as frightened, as having been put in fear of their lives by people who showed a total disregard for their well-being. That fear is not an emotional response that resolves itself when the police make an arrest. It is a condition that has been cultivated deliberately by the network, precisely because it makes victims less likely to testify. That the women in this case testified despite it was what made the convictions possible. On the 17th of October 2019, the 3 defendants were sentenced at Snaresbrook Crown Court. Eleonora Vasileva received 11 years in prison. She was also served with a 15-year slavery and trafficking prevention order, a civil order that would impose significant restrictions on her activities on release, including restrictions on travel, on managing or operating any business involving the provision of services by adults, and on contact with potential trafficking victims. The order would run for 15 years from the date of sentencing, extending her legal constraint well beyond the prison sentence itself. Ilya Mikhailov received 10 years and was also served with a 15-year slavery and trafficking prevention order. Marian Ninov Vasilev received 3 years, reflecting the court's assessment of his more limited operational role compared to the principal architects of the network. Vasileva's role as the organizer and architect of the operation placed her at the top of the culpability hierarchy in the court's sentencing analysis. The prosecution described her function with precision. She had recruited the sex workers in Bulgaria, arranged their travel to the United Kingdom, paid for the rented properties, organised and paid for the online advertising that brought clients to those properties, and controlled the prostitution operation on an ongoing basis. She was the person who had constructed the infrastructure, maintained it, and directed it. Mikhailov had provided the cocaine that the women were required to sell, and had served as the enforcer who kept the women in line through fear and through violence when needed. Vasilev had assisted the other 2 in the running of the enterprise, a supporting role that the court reflected in the significantly shorter sentence he received. The operation the 3 of them built had moved women from Bulgaria to East London and had held them in conditions that the legislation under which they were convicted, the Modern Slavery Act and its predecessors, was specifically designed to address. The Modern Slavery Act 2015 consolidated previous legislation criminalising trafficking and all forms of exploitation under a single statutory framework, making it possible to charge the full scope of what a network like Vasileva's was doing within a coherent legal structure rather than across multiple separate offences that might individually fail to capture the full severity of the conduct. The conviction on the human trafficking counts, the prostitution control counts, and the drug supply counts together gave a picture that was more complete than any single charge would have provided. What the Vasileva network was, in its essential structure, was an import business with a human commodity. Women were sourced in one country, transported across a border, installed in rented premises, and put to work generating revenue for a network that controlled every aspect of their circumstances. The distance between Sofia and London was the operational gap that the network exploited, the gap in which the promise of legitimate work could be made credibly in the origin country and the reality imposed brutally in the destination. The network relied on that distance, on the vulnerability it creates in people who arrive in a foreign city without money, without contacts, without language, and without any of the resources that might allow them to seek help outside the structure that has brought them there. The £200 airport fee was the first move. Everything that followed was designed to ensure that the gap between the women's situation and any available exit remained too wide to cross. Vasileva managed that gap from an address in Custom House, East London. The courts gave her 11 years for it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Eleonora Vasileva ran a trafficking network that moved women from Bulgaria to brothels across East London and held them through debt, restriction, and the threat of violence. The operation required a ringleader who could organise across 2 countries, and the courts reflected that in an 11-year sentence. Next, we move to a woman who found a way to run a drug supply network from a location where most people assume crime cannot be directed, from inside a prison, using mobile phones purchased by her own mother and drones flown over the walls. Section 7. Alexandra Nicolau, The Phones and the Drones. Wormwood Scrubs sits in the London borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, its Victorian brick facade facing Duquesne Road in a part of West London that has grown around it across the century and a half since the prison was built. The 4 towers at its entrance, the high perimeter wall running along the road, the watchtowers visible above the roofline. These are the physical grammar of incarceration, the architectural language that tells the surrounding neighbourhood what is happening inside and that is supposed to communicate something about the finality of containment. A person inside those walls is separated from the city by distance that is not just physical. They are separated by the controlled movement of everything: people, post, visits, communication. The prison controls what goes in and what comes out. That control is the entire operational premise of the institution. Without it, a prison is not a prison. It is a building with walls. What the case of Alexander Mullings and his mother Alexandra Nicolau established, across 3 years of criminal operation and a 6-month trial, was that the control the prison believed it exercised over what passed through its perimeter was significantly less complete than it appeared. The gap between the appearance of containment and its reality was, for the Mullings network, a business opportunity. They exploited it at commercial scale for the better part of a 3-year period, flooding several London prisons with an extensive range of controlled substances, while simultaneously running a drug distribution operation across London and the South East from inside a cell. Alexander Mullings was already a serving prisoner when the operation began. He was not a man who had stumbled into criminality as a young adult and found himself caught on a first serious offence. He was serving a sentence for conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to endanger life, a conviction that was itself committed while he was serving a prior sentence for possession of Class A drugs. The escalating nature of those convictions described a pattern: a man who had continued to conduct criminal business through successive periods of incarceration, for whom imprisonment was an obstacle to be managed rather than an interruption that ended anything. When the drug supply operation that this section is concerned with began in 2016, Mullings was housed in one of several prisons in which he was held across the operation's duration, including HMP Swaleside on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent and HMP Wormwood Scrubs in West London. He was directing a network from inside those institutions, using unauthorised mobile phones, many of which were purchased for him on the outside by his mother. His mother was Alexandra Nicolau. She was born on the 21st of April 1971. She was, in the prosecution's assessment and the court's finding, not simply a parent who had been manipulated into supporting her son's activities without understanding what they were. She was a significant operational and management figure in the network. The 7-year sentence she eventually received reflected that assessment. The mobile phone is the central instrument of modern drug supply operations, and the mobile phone inside a prison is the central instrument of any drug supply operation that continues to function while its principal is incarcerated. The logic is simple, and the numbers explain it. A network that relies on its principal being physically present at the point of transaction is a network that stops when the principal is arrested. A network that operates through telephone communication, through encrypted messaging, through the management of a distribution structure from a distance, is a network that can function with the principal behind a wall, provided the principal has access to a phone. Prisons ban mobile phones precisely because they know this. The ban is enforced through searching, through the use of detection equipment, through monitoring of calls made on authorised prison phone lines, and through intelligence about which prisoners are suspected of operating phones they should not have. The ban is also, in practice, imperfect. Phones are brought in, they are concealed, they are retrieved. The Mullings network understood the imperfection and built its operation around it. Alexandra Nicolau purchased more than 73 mobile phones over a 21-month period. 73 is not a number that reflects a single act of misguided loyalty toward a son in prison. 73 phones purchased over 21 months is an average of approximately 3.5 phones per month. A procurement operation sustained with the regularity and the deliberateness of someone who understood that phones would be found and confiscated and would need to be replaced, and who had made herself responsible for ensuring the supply line remained open. Each phone had to be obtained, packaged, and moved into the prison by whatever means the network was using at any given time to defeat the search regime. The investigation established that drones were used to fly controlled substances and mobile phones over prison walls and into exercise yards or other accessible outdoor spaces within the perimeter. The use of drones in this context was not, by the time of the Mullings prosecution, entirely novel. Drone incursions over British prison perimeters had been documented and reported from at least 2015 onward, and Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service had begun developing counter-drone measures across the estate. But the systematic deployment of drone supply runs as a regular logistics channel for a sustained commercial-scale drug distribution operation represented a level of operational sophistication that the prosecution emphasised throughout the trial. The range of substances being moved through this logistics infrastructure was extensive. The network supplied cannabis and spice, the synthetic cannabinoid that had become a serious problem in British prisons across the period the operation was running, steroids, heroin, cocaine, crack cocaine, and synthetic opioids. Spice in particular had acquired a grim reputation within the prison system by the mid-2000s, not because of its legal status, which had changed when it was banned in 2016 under the Psychoactive Substances Act, but because of its effects. Synthetic cannabinoids are structurally unlike natural cannabis in their pharmacological profile and can produce extreme reactions, including seizures, psychosis, and loss of consciousness, particularly in users who have no tolerance. In an enclosed environment like a prison wing, where the drug is difficult to detect by smell and where access to medical care in the immediate aftermath of an extreme reaction is limited, spice posed a serious risk to the people consuming it. The network that supplied it was not in the business of assessing that risk. It was in the business of meeting demand and extracting revenue. The operation also extended outside the prison walls. While Mullings directed communications from his cell, the network was simultaneously distributing heroin, cocaine, crack cocaine, and synthetic opioids across London and the South East, using the same communications infrastructure and the same personnel. The outside arm of the operation was a conventional drug distribution network, the kind of supply chain that the Metropolitan Police's drugs enforcement units worked against continuously across this period. A principle directing runners and distributors through encrypted messaging, cash moving back through the network, product moving outward to customers at street and mid-level. The inside arm was unusual in its logistics. The two arms were connected by the mobile phones that Nicolau was procuring and getting into the prison. Her son was, in effect, the hub of a dual-facing operation, facing inward toward the prison drug market and facing outward toward the London street market simultaneously, from a cell using phones that should not have been in his possession. The other defendants brought into the prosecution reflected the network structure beyond the mother and son core. Katria Kaplan, 32, was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for her role. Charlotte Finch, 22, received a sentence also arising from her involvement in the network's operations. Dania Wilson, 26, was similarly sentenced. Ahmed bin Fki, 59, received 2 years, suspended for 2 years, with 300 hours of unpaid work, a significantly lighter outcome that reflected a lesser role and the specific offences to which he had pleaded guilty. Hamza Ahmed, a younger defendant whose full details were included in the prosecution's publicly reported sentencing, received 5 years for his role in the conspiracy to convey controlled articles into prison and related offences. Daniel Mazauri Colson, 23, was also sentenced for his role in the network. The breadth of the defendant list reflected the ambition of the operation, a network that ran for 3 years, supplied multiple prisons, and simultaneously serviced a regional drug market outside the prison system, required people in various roles across both dimensions of the enterprise. The investigation that brought the case to court was conducted by the Crown Prosecution Service's Specialist Unit and involved cooperation between the Prison Service, which had intelligence about the phone and drone activity within its institutions, and the police, who were tracking the external dimension of the drug supply operation. The trial at the Crown Court lasted more than 6 months, a duration that reflected the complexity of the evidence: 3 years of communications data, financial records, drug seizure records from inside multiple prisons, witness evidence from prison officers, and the forensic work required to connect the external distribution operation to the prison-based direction of it. The prosecution described the enterprise as commercial scale, a phrase that distinguished it from the smaller, more opportunistic drug supply into prison cases that passed through the courts with some regularity. Cases involving a single delivery of a small quantity of drugs by a visitor or through the post. What Mullings directed, and what Nicolau was an operational part of, was not a single delivery. It was a sustained supply chain with a management structure, a procurement operation, and a logistics arm that operated continuously for 3 years. Robert Hutchinson of the Crown Prosecution Service, the same specialist prosecutor who would later make the sentencing statement in the Deborah Mason cocaine case, described the operation at sentencing in terms that addressed both the scale of it and the specific role of the mobile phones. He said that Mullings had tried to present himself at trial as merely a middleman, but that the evidence placed him front and centre of the enterprise, controlling and directing his co-conspirators from his prison cell. The claim of middleman status is a standard defensive position in drug supply cases, and in Mullings's case it was particularly difficult to sustain, given the evidence of what the phones were being used for. The thousands of messages and calls made from prison on unauthorised devices documented a man who was not receiving and passing on instructions, he was giving them. The significance of Alexandra Nicolau's role within this framework requires some careful thinking about what it means to manage a criminal operation from outside when the principal is inside. The person on the outside who procures and supplies the phones is not performing a peripheral service. Without the phones, the operation does not function. The entire premise of the prison-directed drug network depends on communication, and the communication depends on the phones, and the phones depended on Nicolau. 73 phones over 21 months was not a favour done for a son in difficult circumstances. It was an ongoing operational commitment to the functioning of a criminal enterprise. The court's finding that she held a significant operational and management role, rather than treating her as a misguided mother who did not understand what she was enabling, was a finding grounded in that arithmetic. Purchasing 3.5 phones per month for 21 consecutive months in the service of a drug network is not an act of ignorance. It is an act of sustained, deliberate participation. The sentence Nicolau received at the Crown Court reflected that finding. She was convicted of 3 counts of conspiracy to convey List A articles into prison, conspiracy to convey List B articles into prison, conspiracy to supply a controlled drug of Class A, conspiracy to supply a controlled drug of Class B, converting or transferring criminal property, and the unauthorised transmission of an image or sound by electronic communication from within a prison. The range of charges across those counts captured the full scope of what she had done, not simply the phone procurement, but the money laundering that moved the criminal proceeds of the operation, and the communications offences arising from her participation in the prison's unauthorised communication network. The total sentence was 7 years. The specific offence of transmitting communications from within a prison in an unauthorised manner was one that applied not only to the prisoners using the illegal phones, but to the people on the outside who were party to those communications. Every message exchanged between Mullings on his prison phone and Nicolau or any other external member of the network was an unauthorised transmission from within the prison. The scale of the messaging involved, thousands of calls and messages documented across the investigation, made this a significant element of the prosecution's case. All defendants were convicted of the transmission offence, in addition to whatever their specific drug supply or prison contraband convictions required. Hutchinson's statement noted that all defendants had shown a blatant disregard for the ban on mobile phones in prison, a ban that exists because the control of communications is fundamental to the discipline and safety of inmates and staff. The Mullings network's blatant disregard for it was structural. It was not incidental non-compliance by people who thought they were unlikely to be caught. It was a business model built on the assumption that the ban could be defeated indefinitely. There is an analytical thread that connects the cases in this list, across their evident differences of method and setting. Alice Diamond built a gang whose operational security rested on the personal loyalty of women drawn from the same tightly connected community. Women who understood that silence was both a professional obligation and a mutual protection. Deborah Mason built a cocaine network from family ties, using the same relational logic. Alexandra Nicolau's role in the Mullings operation was different in its specific character, but recognisable in its underlying structure. A woman who occupied a central logistical function within a criminal enterprise, whose proximity to the principal and whose personal reliability made her indispensable to its operation. The difference was that Nicolau was not operating in her own right as a criminal entrepreneur. She was making herself into a supply chain in service of her son's enterprise. The kinship logic running not from a matriarch outward, as it did with Mason, but from a son inward, toward a mother who allowed the pull of that relationship to determine her choices for 3 years. The courts did not treat the relational context as a mitigating factor sufficient to alter the fundamental nature of what she had done. The phones were real, the drugs were real, the 3 years were real. 7 years was the answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Alexandra Nicolau sustained a prison drug network by procuring more than 70 phones over 21 months, becoming as central to the operation's function as the son who directed it from his cell. The case illustrated how criminal networks adapt their logistics to the constraints imposed on their principals. Next, we examine a case with none of the operational complexity of a trafficking ring or a drug distribution network, but with the same city as its backdrop. A woman whose violent history and her connections to London's street-level gang economy brought her before the courts with consequences that would define her life. Section 8. Sabrina Quider, the bonfire in Wimbledon. Wimbledon Park Road runs through the residential heart of Southfields in southwest London, a neighbourhood of Victorian terraces and Edwardian mansion flats that has settled, over the decades, into the quiet prosperity of an area that lies within reach of good schools and the District Line. The houses along this stretch of road are the kind that estate agents photograph carefully, their bay windows and symmetrical facades suggesting a certain kind of London life. Orderly, comfortable, aspiring. The flat at one address on this road was valued at approximately £900,000. Its occupants were a fashion designer and a financial analyst. They had 2 young children. In January 2016, a 20-year-old French woman named Sophie Lyonnais moved into the flat to work as their au pair. She had finished a vocational course in childcare in France, had taken the position in London through a contact, and was looking forward to a period of work in one of the great cities of Europe. She telephoned her mother often in those first weeks. She seemed happy. Within months, she was being subjected to systematic torture inside the flat she had arrived at expecting a job. In September 2017, she was dead. Her body was burned on a bonfire in the back garden. The occupants of the flat barbecued chicken beside the fire in an effort to mask the smell. Sabrina Quider had been born in Algeria in 1983 and had grown up in France before coming to London in 2005, initially as an au pair herself, arriving in the city at the age of 22 with the same intention that would bring Sophie Lyonnais to her door more than a decade later. Wissem Madouni, her long-term partner, had come with her and found work as a financial analyst at a bank. Quider built a career as a fashion designer and makeup artist. By the time Sophie Lyonnais entered their lives, the couple was settled and professionally established, living in a flat in Southfields that reflected a material success built across a decade in London. From the outside, there was no reason to see anything other than what it appeared to be: a professional couple with children looking for domestic help, operating at the comfortable midpoint of southwest London life. What existed underneath that surface was a delusional architecture that the court at the Old Bailey would later spend 2 months unpacking. Quider had a previous relationship with a man named Mark Walton, a music industry figure who had once been part of the pop group Boyzone and had since moved into music management. The relationship had ended. Quider had not let it go. In the years before Sophie Lyonnais arrived, Quider had made more than 30 separate reports to the police about Walton, all of which were assessed as unfounded. She had been given a police caution for harassing him and for creating a fake Facebook account through which she accused him of being a paedophile. She had called Walton accusing him of using black magic against her and of hiring a helicopter to fly over her home and conduct surveillance. The delusional disorder that the court later identified as part of her clinical presentation had fixed itself onto Walton as its object, and the fixation had found, in Sophie Lyonnais, a new focus. Quider became convinced that Sophie was working with Walton. The logic of the belief, such as it was, held that Walton had recruited the au pair to gather evidence against Quider from inside her own home, to drug her, to harm her children, to collaborate in a conspiracy whose shape kept shifting, but whose centre was always Walton, and always the conviction that she was being persecuted. Sophie had never met Walton. She had come to London from France for a childcare job. She looked after the children, made friends with other nannies in the area, and sent messages home to her mother describing her days. None of that was visible to Cuida, whose delusional framework had already decided what Sophie was and what she was doing. The interrogations began. Cuida recorded them. More than 8 hours of recordings were eventually recovered by the Metropolitan Police and played at the Old Bailey trial. Recordings in which Sophie could be heard being questioned, slapped, and accused of being a spy, a collaborator, and something the prosecution described as worse than a murderer, in Cuida's own words during the sessions. The judge at sentencing, Nicholas Hilliard, described what had been done to Sophie during those interrogations as horrible cruelty and humiliation. He described the allegations against her as a complete fiction, motivated by a desire for revenge that had no basis in anything Sophie had actually done. Sophie was, in the judge's description, a kind, gentle and good-natured girl. She was 21 years old. She was being held in an apartment in Wimbledon and interrogated on tape while her employers accused her of crimes she had no part in and no knowledge of. The physical injuries Sophie sustained across the period of the torture were established through the post-mortem examination conducted by forensic pathologists. She had suffered 5 broken ribs, a fractured jawbone, a fractured sternum, and a cracked breastbone. These injuries were consistent with sustained, repeated violence applied across a period of time rather than with a single incident. She had been beaten with an electrical cable. The specific cause of death could not be determined with certainty because of the condition of the body after it had been burned, but the prosecution's case was that she had been drowned in the bathtub during one of the final interrogation sessions, with the most likely causes of death being a blow to the head, strangulation, or drowning. She died in September 2017. In the immediate aftermath, Cuida and Maduni attempted to account for what had happened. Maduni initially said Sophie had died by accident while he was interrogating her in the bath, though he later changed this account to say that Cuida had woken him, telling him that Sophie was unresponsive. Cuida told police that Sophie had died in her sleep. Both of them admitted to disposing of the body. Neither accepted responsibility for the killing. The bonfire in the garden, with the chicken barbecuing alongside it to manage the smell, was the method they had chosen. When neighbours eventually reported the fire and the smell to the police, the investigation that followed led directly to the flat and to the evidence of what had been happening inside it. The recordings were there. The forensic traces were there. Sophie's own notes, found during the search of the property, were there. Walton himself travelled from Los Angeles to give evidence at the trial, in which the prosecution said he had shouldered the slurs against him and responded with integrity and honesty. The trial at the Old Bailey lasted 2 months. It began in March 2018. Cuida and Maduni both denied murder throughout, each directing the blame at the other. The prosecution presented the recorded interrogations, the forensic pathology evidence, the physical injuries, and the account of Sophie's treatment that had been assembled from the digital and physical evidence in the flat. On 24 May 2018, the jury found both defendants guilty of murder. The judge sentenced each of them to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. For Cuida, the 30-year minimum reflected the court's assessment of her role as the primary architect of what had been done to Sophie, the person whose delusion had generated the false belief that drove the torture, and the person whose sustained cruelty across the preceding months had created the conditions in which Sophie died. At the sentencing hearing, a letter from Cuida addressed to Sophie was read to the court. It expressed sorrow and described her as suffering every day thinking of what had happened. It closed with the hope that Sophie was at peace. The letter was read in the same courtroom where the recordings of Cuida conducting the interrogations had been played to the jury, and its language of personal grief sat uneasily beside the evidence of what those recordings contained. Cuida acknowledged the suffering she had caused. The acknowledgement came after a 2-month trial in which she had denied causing it. Sophie Lyonnais' family in France were represented at the proceedings. Her parents had lost a daughter who had come to London for a childcare job and had found something that neither they nor she could have anticipated from the circumstances of her arrival. The judge had noted that she was a kind, gentle, and good-natured girl. The recordings confirmed only that she had been treated as neither kind people nor gentle ones deserved to be treated. Walton, the man whose name had been at the centre of the delusion that killed her, had nothing to do with her death or her life. He was a name, fixed in the architecture of Quidare's disorder, around which an elaborate and murderous fiction had been constructed. Quidare will be in her mid-60s before she becomes eligible for parole consideration. Maduni will be in his 70s. The flat on Wimbledon Park Road, with its £900,000 valuation, is a fixture of the southwest London property market. What happened inside it in the months between January 2016 and September 2017 is part of the Old Bailey's record and part of London's. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sabrina Quidare received a life sentence with a minimum of 30 years for a murder driven by paranoid delusion and conducted through sustained domestic violence against a young woman who had come to London looking for work. Next, we pull the camera back and examine the shape of organised crime built by women across London's history, looking at the patterns, the structures, and the sentences that connect the cases in this list to each other and to the city that produced them. Section 9. Shirley Pitts, the Last Queen. Shirley Sally Pitts was born on Lambeth Walk on the 24th of November 1934, the daughter of Harry Pitts, a man the records describe as an inept criminal who would eventually die in Parkhurst Prison in 1962, and a woman named Nell Taylor, who became an alcoholic and who at some point sold the family's ration books, leaving her children without the entitlement to the food those books represented. By the time Shirley was 7 years old, she was already stealing. Not for excitement, not for profit. She was stealing bread and milk to feed her 5 younger siblings because there was nothing else available to feed them. By 7, she already understood something about the relationship between necessity and criminality that most people only encounter as an abstract proposition. The knowledge was not arrived at through any process of analysis. It was the direct product of her circumstances, a family in which the father was incarcerated, the mother was incapacitated, and the oldest child had to find ways to keep the younger ones alive. She was evacuated to Yorkshire during the Second World War, separated from the South London geography that would later become the defining landscape of her professional life, and she spent her teenage years moving between reform schools, the institutional response to a child whose behaviour the authorities categorised as problematic, without ever fully engaging with the conditions that had produced it. Reform schools did not reform Shirley Pitts. They gave her time, and they gave her a sharper understanding of what the law could and could not reach. The education that changed her life came from a different institution entirely. The 40 Elephants, the all-female shoplifting organisation that Alice Diamond had led in its most celebrated iteration, and that had passed through successive queens after Diamond's 1925 imprisonment, was still operating in the 1940s when Pitts came into contact with its senior members. The gang by this period was under the authority of Maggie Hill, the sister of the North London criminal Billy Hill, and its methods had been refined across 7 decades into a body of professional knowledge that was passed between generations of women with the seriousness of a trade apprenticeship. Pitts was taken under the wing of the older women and taught. She learnt the techniques that the gang had developed and adapted across half a century. The modification of clothing to include concealed compartments, the correct way to handle merchandise in a department store without triggering the attention of floor staff, the reading of a shop's surveillance arrangements, the management of multiple aliases to prevent the accumulation of a recognised face in any single store or police district. She learned what the 40 Elephants called the craft, and she was good at it. By her early 20s, she was one of the foremost shoplifters in Britain. The assessment came from police records, and from the observations of the store detectives, most of them women themselves by this point, who had been deployed specifically to counter the 40 Elephants' methods. The distinction in being described as the foremost in the country was not a journalistic embellishment. It was an operational judgment based on the difficulty of catching her, the scale of what she was taking, and the sophistication of the methods she was deploying. Her primary targets were the Great West End stores, Harrods in Knightsbridge, Harvey Nichols on Sloane Street, Selfridges on Oxford Street. These were the institutions whose open display of high-value merchandise made them productive and whose social cachet made her, dressed expensively and moving with the confidence of a customer of means, effectively invisible to the staff whose instinct was to defer rather than scrutinize. Her techniques evolved with the technology of retail security. The earlier 40 Elephants had worked in an era of open counters and no security infrastructure beyond attentive shop assistants. By the time Pitts was at the height of her career in the 1960s and 1970s, department stores had begun using security tags on merchandise, electronic systems that triggered alarms at the exits when tagged items passed through. Pitts adapted. She developed what those who knew her called magic bags, carrier bags lined internally with tinfoil, a material that disrupts the radio frequency signal generated by security tags and prevents the alarm from activating as the bag passes through the detection frame at the door. The bags looked like ordinary shopping bags. They functioned as a defeat mechanism for the most significant single piece of anti-theft technology the retail industry had deployed. She made them herself. When she had finished in one store, she would leave the stolen merchandise in a car parked outside and walk into the next store and begin again. On a productive day, across multiple stores, the value of what she took could be substantial. She ran teams of hoisters, not just as a solo operator, but as an organizer of other women working in coordinated groups across the West End and across the country. The national reach of the 40 Elephants under Diamond and Hill was sustained under Pitts. Teams of women moving through the quality stores of Manchester and Birmingham and Bristol, with the same methodical discipline applied to the London operations. She used 7 or 8 aliases across her career, each one corresponding to a different set of identity documents and a different known appearance. Different wigs, different outfits, different personal styles, constructed to give her multiple distinct identities in the records of stores and police districts that were trying to track her movements. The management of those identities across decades was its own kind of administrative operation, requiring the maintenance of documents and wardrobes and personal histories consistent enough to withstand scrutiny. She maintained it for 40 years. 7 children came from 3 different relationships across that period. 5 of them were from her partnership with a man named Chris Hawkins, who ran a fruit and vegetable stall in Hoxton Market, and who beat her until the Cray twins, with whom Pitts was well acquainted, had a word with him about it. He stopped. She later adopted his surname. Ronnie Knight, the club owner and South London criminal figure, later convicted of handling proceeds from the Security Express robbery, was among her connections. Charlie Wilson, one of the great train robbers, was another. Pitts moved through the same social world as these men, the nightclubs and the parties of East and South London's criminal upper tier, but she was not an appendage of that world. She was a professional in her own right, operating a criminal enterprise whose scope and longevity put it alongside the male criminal operations of the same era, without being subordinate to any of them. She was jailed 3 times across her career, serving a total of approximately 3 years in custody. In the context of 40 years of sustained professional crime, 3 years is a very low ratio of incarceration to activity, and it reflects both the difficulty of building a prosecutable case against a person who operated across multiple aliases and multiple jurisdictions, and Pitts' own cardinal professional rule: she never informed on anyone. The Hoisters Code that the 40 Elephants had maintained since Alice Diamond's era was a code Pitts observed completely. There were people she had worked with who were caught, tried, and convicted. None of them was there because Pitts had spoken to the police about them. That record of silence, sustained across a career of 4 decades, was itself a significant professional achievement, and a reason why the criminal world in which she moved trusted her. On one occasion, she achieved something almost nobody in British criminal history has managed. She got out of a prison van while being transferred to court. The reason she gave, in the account she later dictated to her biographer, was that she did not want her daughter to be born in prison. One of her 7 children was close to term during a period when she was in custody, and the prospect of the birth occurring within the prison system was something she was not willing to accept. She got out of the van. The birth was not in prison. The escape itself was treated, in the criminal world she inhabited, as the kind of story that gets told across a generation, an audacious, practical act, driven not by ideology or desperation, but by a straightforward maternal calculation. She diversified, in the later stages of her career, into fraud, as the 40 Elephants had done under various queens, when the hoisting operation became harder to sustain against improved retail security. She expanded operations into Europe, taking teams of shoplifters to continental department stores where the surveillance regimes were less sophisticated and the British criminal record that attached to her aliases had no reach. She was, in this period, running something closer to an international retail crime operation than a domestic gang, adapting the traditional 40 elephants model to the changed conditions of a later era with the flexibility that had always characterized the best of the organization's leadership. She died of breast cancer on the 16th of March 1992. She was 57 years old. The funeral that followed was elaborate and expensive, the kind of send-off that the criminal communities of South and East London have traditionally provided for figures of significant status, an occasion that makes the hierarchy of the underworld visible in the accumulation of mourners and the scale of the floral arrangements. A blessing was held at the Roman Catholic Church of the Assumption in Chigwell, Essex, where Pitts had been living in her final years. She was buried at Lambeth Cemetery, which was the appropriate location, in a £5,000 blue Zandra Rhodes dress that the press speculated, with some plausibility, she may have obtained through her established professional methods, rather than through retail purchase. Among the floral tributes was a 6-foot arrangement in the shape of a shopping trolley. It was the kind of gesture that tells you everything about the community making it. The Crays and Charlie Wilson and Ronnie Knight were part of her world. The shopping trolley was her. The national press covered the funeral. The coverage was affectionate in the particular way that British journalism has always been affectionate toward criminal figures, whose crimes were directed at property rather than people, who operated with a certain audacity and style, and who maintained across their careers the specific kind of professional dignity that consists of not talking to the police. Pitts had prided herself, she said at various points in the recollections she dictated to her biographer Lorraine Gammon, on 2 things. She had never informed, and she had never been involved in violence. In a criminal world where both of those things were common, those 2 refusals were the foundations of a reputation that lasted the length of a career and survived it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Shirley Pitts ran the 40 Elephants for 4 decades and was buried with a 6-foot floral shopping trolley, the last queen of a criminal tradition that had begun in the Victorian slums of South London. Next we move to East London and to a woman who had lived on the fringes of the armed robbery world before deciding she could do it herself, and who became, by her own account, one of the most accomplished blaggers in London before a murder conviction at the Old Bailey gave her a life sentence and 18 years in Holloway. Section 10. Linda Calvey, the Black Widow. Roman Road Market in Bow runs east from Grove Road through the heart of the East End, a street market that has operated in one form or another since the 19th century, the stalls selling fabric and household goods and food to the working families of the borough of Tower Hamlets and its surrounding streets. In the 1950s, when Linda Welford was growing up in the area, the market was still the economic and social spine of a neighbourhood that had been bombed heavily during the Blitz and was rebuilding itself with the particular stubbornness of East London communities that had nowhere else to go. Her mother ran a wig stall on Roman Road. Her father was a blacksmith who made dockers' hooks, the steel tools that the men on the loading floors of the docks used to handle cargo. It was an ordinary working life in an ordinary East London street, the kind of background that produces most of the people who grow up inside it without any particular criminal consequence. For Linda Welford, growing up alongside the market stalls and the dockers' trade and the tight social geography of post-war Bow, the departure from ordinariness began at a party and with a man, and it did not end for more than 50 years. She was 19 years old when she attended a homecoming party for Mickey Calvey, who was on temporary home leave from a prison sentence. Mickey Calvey was an armed robber, a professional in the specific East London tradition of the blag, the term for the armed robbery of security vans and cash deliveries that had sustained criminal gangs in the East End since before the Crays had made it their business. He was serving an 8-year sentence when Linda met him. She has described the meeting in terms that were clear-eyed about what he was from the beginning. She knew he was a bank robber the day she met him, and she went into it with her eyes open. She fell in love with him. He threw stolen money around, she has said, like leaves fallen from an autumn tree. He married her at 22, brought to the wedding under armed escort from the prison where he was serving the remaining portion of his sentence. They had 2 children, a daughter named Melanie and a son named Neil. She adopted his surname and became Linda Calvi, the name she would carry through every subsequent chapter of a life that became, by any measure, one of the most turbulent criminal histories produced by East London in the second half of the 20th century. Mickey Calvi was killed on December 9, 1978. He was part of a gang attempting to rob a Securicor security van, collecting the takings from a supermarket in Eltham, southeast London. A police marksman shot him. He died at the scene. Linda Calvi was 30 years old, a widow with 2 young children, and something happened to her in the immediate aftermath of that loss that she has described in various interviews and public accounts with a consistent explanation. Her brain clicked. The careful, considered version of herself, the one that had remained on the periphery of her husband's criminal world as a practical support rather than a participant, simply ceased to operate. She has said that she felt compelled to take over from him, to continue what he had been doing, to prove something to herself and to the world that had taken him. The psychologists who examine criminal trajectories might frame it differently. What the evidence shows is that within a relatively short time of Mickey's death, she had moved from the periphery of the armed robbery world to its active centre. She became, first, a getaway driver. The role placed her at the scene of robberies without requiring her to enter the location or confront the staff directly, a position of partial exposure that gave her time to learn and to acclimatise to the operational reality of what she was now doing. She has recalled the tricks of the trade from this period with the specificity of someone who found the work absorbing rather than frightening. Fake bus stops erected as loitering points for the gang members casing a target, temporary workmen's huts used to store equipment, the planning of escape routes timed against the response times of the local police. She was meticulous, the same quality that would later work against her. The getaway driving was not enough. She progressed, by her own account, to taking direct part in the hold-ups, entering the premises with the rest of the gang, armed with a sawn-off shotgun, confronting the staff and the security personnel and forcing compliance at gunpoint. She has said she loved the buzz of it. She loved picking up the shotgun, confronting men in armoured vans and forcing them to hand over vast sums of money. She has also said she thought the money was rightfully hers, which is the particular logic of someone who has decided that the conventional economy has withheld what it owed. Across approximately a dozen armed robberies in the mid-1980s, targeting post offices in Essex and in Tower Hamlets, her gang netted a total estimated at the equivalent of £1 million in today's money. The operations were planned and efficient, each raid conducted in under 2 minutes to minimise exposure. Her crew included associates Brian Thorogood and Carl Gibney. Her brother Anthony Welford allowed his house to be used as a base for the gang and was later jailed for 9 years for conspiracy to rob as a result. The gang's proficiency reached a level that the prosecution at her eventual trial described as skillfully, effectively and ruthlessly carried out. One Tower Hamlets post office was robbed by the same gang on 2 separate occasions. The police were eventually tipped off, not through surveillance, but through a private detective hired by the jealous wife of a gang member who suspected her husband of having an affair. The private detective was looking for evidence of infidelity. He found a gang of armed robbers. The information reached the police. She was arrested and charged with armed robbery. At trial in 1986, she was convicted and sentenced to 7 years. She served approximately 3 years, gaining release in 1989 on parole. She returned to an East London that had changed somewhat in her absence, and to a social world that connected directly back to her husband Mickey's former associates. One of those associates was a man named Ronnie Cook. Cook had known Mickey Calvi before his death and had provided money to Linda Calvi in the period immediately following her bereavement, a gesture of solidarity from within the criminal community toward a widow with 2 children. By the time she was released from her armed robbery sentence, Cook and Calvi had become involved. Cook treated her, she has recalled, like a princess. He bought her a wardrobe of fur coats. He took her to Las Vegas. He presented her with a diamond ring and told her, in language that she has quoted with some irony across the decades, that the ring meant she belonged to him now. Cook was also violent and controlling in ways that escalated as the relationship progressed. He dictated what she wore. He followed her when she went out with friends. When she declined his marriage proposal, he threatened to hurt her son Neil, He was convicted of attempted armed robbery and sentenced to 16 years in prison. But from inside that sentence, he continued to attempt to control her life, at one point allegedly arranging for her to visit him in hospital under armed guard, wearing specific clothing. She agreed, she has said, on the grounds that with any luck, the effort would give him a heart attack. While Cook was serving his sentence, a man named Brian Thorogood, one of her former robbery associates, became her minder, appointed by Cook to watch over her. The arrangement did not go as Cook intended. Calvi had an affair with Thorogood instead. She has also said, in accounts given across several decades, that Cook told her he was responsible for Mickey's death. The claim, as she reported it, was that Cook had deliberately locked Mickey out of the getaway vehicle during the Eltham robbery, knowing the consequence, because he had fallen in love with Linda at the moment he saw her on the doorstep, and decided that Mickey was an obstacle. Whether Cook made this claim, and whether it was true, was never established in a court. What it did, in the account Calvi has given, was crystallise a rage that had been building for years into something specific and actionable. In late 1990, approximately 18 months after her release on parole from the armed robbery sentence, she paid a criminal associate named Daniel Rees £10,000 to kill Ronnie Cook. Rees lost his nerve. Cook was on day release from prison and had come to the home Linda Calvi shared near the Royal Docks in East London. Rees shot him, but the shot was not fatal. It hit Cook in the kneecap. According to the prosecution's account, established through the evidence of a neighbour and through the testimony of Rees himself, what happened next was that Calvi took the gun. A neighbour reported hearing a woman's voice shout the word "Kneel" before a second shot was fired. The second shot was fired at point-blank range into Cook's head. It killed him. It also broke his neck. Gangster Frankie Fraser, a witness to the social world in which all of these people moved, later told journalists that Calvi had done it because Cook was about to find out she had been spending some of his money, a financial motive that the prosecution incorporated alongside the broader personal history of the relationship. The prosecutor described the motive at trial as a desire to simplify the rather dangerous and complex state of her personal affairs. Both Linda Calvi and Daniel Rees were charged with murder. The trial was heard in November 1991. She denied being the person who fired the fatal shot, a denial she has maintained consistently across every subsequent decade. She has argued in various forums, including the 2025 BBC podcast series dedicated to her case, that Rees carried out the killing independently, that she was calling out her son's name rather than ordering Cook to kneel, and that forensic testing conducted on the day of the murder eliminated her as a handler of the weapon. She has expressed the hope that retired detectives will come forward to acknowledge that the forensic evidence was disregarded. The jury at her 1991 trial was not persuaded by her account. They convicted her of murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Rees was convicted alongside her. They subsequently married in HM Prison Durham, a marriage that did not survive their shared incarceration. She served 18 years. During that time, she was housed alongside some of the most notorious women in the British prison system of the era, including Rose West and Myra Hindley. She is recounted striking Hindley on one occasion for singing, a breach of what Calvi apparently considered the appropriate decorum of shared incarceration. She was released in 2009. She married a millionaire named George Caesar in Dymchurch, Kent, on April 4, 2009, a marriage that gave her a third surname and a period of settled domesticity that she had not experienced across most of her adult life. Caesar died in September 2015. She has since become a great-grandmother of 8, living in Chigwell, Essex, a short distance from the Chigwell church where Shirley Pitts was blessed before burial in 1992. Reggie Cray, she has noted across several interviews, once proposed to her. She told him not to be silly. The 2025 BBC podcast series, 6 episodes titled Gangster, gave Calvi the most sustained public platform she had been offered for her account of events, and it attracted, according to the BBC, millions of listeners. The platform allowed her to present the version of the Cook killing she has always maintained, and to reflect on the broader arc of a criminal life that began with a party for a man on day release from prison in the East End of London in the late 1960s. She has said she cannot believe, looking back, that she was the woman who did the things she did. She has said she has great regrets about the criminal path she took. She has also said she will not stop trying to clear her name of the murder conviction, the one crime in a long criminal career that she refuses to own. The courts gave it to her in 1991. She has been carrying it back to them in various forms ever since. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.